34 years of marriage ended on a Tuesday morning over a misplaced iPad charger. I went into Barbara's home office to borrow hers. Her iPad was sitting unlocked on the desk. I tapped the screen to check the battery level. An open email stared back at me. It wasn't a love letter to another man. It was worse. It was a message to Robert Vance, the most aggressive and ruthless divorce attorney in our entire county. Attached to that email was a document titled Asset Liquidation Projections. I sat down in her chair and opened the file. Barbara had spent the last 6 months meticulously cataloging every dollar I had earned, every property we owned, and the exact estimated value of the 3 hardware stores I built from the ground up. She had photographs of my private financial files. She had recent appraisals of my vintage car collection. Her email read, "I want the business, the lake house, and maximum alimony. Serve him right after the holidays." The betrayal was absolute, cold, and entirely calculated. She was not leaving because she was unhappy or unfulfilled. She was executing a hostile takeover of my life. I did not yell. I did not confront her. I forwarded the email to my own private address, deleted the sent record from her device, locked her iPad, and walked out of the room. The war had officially started, but she was the only one who didn't know I was already fighting back. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and watched her walk in from the garden. She smiled at me, asked how my morning was going, and kissed my cheek. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed to smile back and tell her my morning was just fine. I left for work a few minutes later, my mind running through 34 years of history. I opened my first hardware store in 1990. I worked 60-hour weeks, missing dinners, weekends, and vacations to build a foundation for our family. Barbara worked the registers in the early days, but as the business grew, she stepped back. By the time we opened the 3rd location in 2005, her primary occupation was managing her social calendar, playing tennis at the country club, and redecorating our home every few years. I never complained. I wanted her to have a comfortable life. I thought we were partners enjoying the fruits of our labor. Now, I realized I was just the workhorse, and she was preparing to send me to the glue factory. I arrived at my main office, locked the door, and called Arthur. Arthur was not just my corporate attorney. He was a friend I had known since college. He handled all my business contracts, real estate acquisitions, and estate planning. I told him I needed to see him immediately. I drove across town to his firm, walked past his secretary, and shut the door behind me. I handed him the printed email and the asset spreadsheet. Arthur put on his reading glasses, reviewed the documents in silence, and let out a long breath. He looked up at me and asked what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to protect everything I had built, legally and decisively. Before she filed her papers, Arthur leaned back in his leather chair and began outlining our counter strategy. He reminded me of a critical legal maneuver we had executed 12 years ago, one that Barbara had completely forgotten or never fully understood. When our first grandson was born, I wanted to ensure the business would survive for the next generation. Arthur had set up the family legacy trust. I transferred the holding company that owned the 3 hardware stores and the commercial real estate they sat on into this irrevocable trust. I was the managing trustee, drawing a salary, but I did not technically own the business assets anymore. The trust owned them. At the time, Barbara had to sign a spousal waiver acknowledging the transfer. She had signed the massive stack of legal documents without reading a single page, too preoccupied with planning a Mediterranean cruise with her friends. Arthur confirmed that because the trust was irrevocable and established over a decade ago, Vance would have an impossible time piercing it. The business was safe. It was entirely off the marital table that left the liquid assets, the primary residence, the lake house, and my classic cars. The cars were my passion. To restored Mustangs and a pristine Corvette. I asked Arthur how to protect them. He advised me to sell them immediately for fair market value to someone I trusted. I called my brother David. David had always admired the cars. I sold him all 3 vehicles that afternoon. However, no cash changed hands. Instead, we executed a legally binding 20-year promissory note at a minimal interest rate. David owned the cars. The marital estate now owned a piece of paper that trickled in a few $100s a month. If Barbara wanted half the value of the cars, she would have to wait 20 years to collect it, month by month. The cash was the next target. We had a joint investment account and a joint checking account holding significant funds. Arthur explained that either party in a joint account has the legal right to withdraw funds. Taking all of it would look vindictive and anger a judge. Taking exactly half was legally sound and defensible. I drove to the bank. I requested a certified check for exactly 50% of the total balance across all joint accounts. I deposited that check into a newly created account under my name only at a completely different banking institution. I left her exactly her half of the liquid cash. The real estate was trickier. The primary residence and the lake house were deeded jointly. There was no quick way to move them without triggering immediate alarms. I decided to concede the houses. I would let her fight for the real estate, knowing that the equity in the homes was a fraction of the value of the business she mistakenly thought she was going to get. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. I went to work, reviewed inventory, managed my employees, and came home to a woman who was actively plotting my financial ruin. We attended a dinner party with our neighbors. I watched Barbara drink wine, laugh at jokes, and hold my hand across the table, knowing she had already approved a draft of the divorce petition. It was a masterclass in deception. I matched her performance perfectly. I spoke about our upcoming summer plans. I discussed fixing the deck at the lake house. Every time she smiled at me, I visualized the signed trust documents locked in Arthur's vault. I felt no sorrow, no grief, and no hesitation. The woman I loved had vanished, replaced by a greedy stranger calculating her payday. On a Monday morning, the trap finally sprang. I was at the main store going over supply orders when a process server walked into my office. He asked for my name, handed me a thick manila envelope, and walked out. I opened it. It was exactly what I expected. A petition for dissolution of marriage. The demands attached were staggering. Vance had drafted a brutal document. Barbara was demanding the primary residence, the lake house, 70% of all liquid assets, and 50% of the valuation of the hardware stores. She also demanded massive permanent alimony, claiming she had sacrificed her own earning potential to support my career. She wanted me to pay her legal fees. It was a declaration of total war. I picked up the phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight but triumphant. She told me she was sorry it had to come to this, but she needed to find herself, and she deserved her fair share of what we built. I told her I had received the papers. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I told her I would have my lawyer contact hers, and that I would be staying at the lake house until we sorted this out. She sounded relieved that I was not screaming or begging. She told me she thought this was the most mature way to handle things. I hung up the phone, packed a bag, and drove to the lake house. 3 weeks later, the mediation meeting took place. This is a mandatory step in our state before a judge will hear a contested divorce case. We met in a large, sterile conference room at a neutral mediator's office. Barbara sat on one side of the long wooden table, flanked by Vance. She wore a sharp, expensive suit, looking confident and expectant. I sat across from her with Arthur by my side. I wore a simple collared shirt and slacks. Vance opened the proceedings. He was a slick man, arrogant and accustomed to steamrolling his opponents. He slid a thick binder across the table. He announced that his client was prepared to be reasonable. He reiterated their demands. He spent 10 minutes detailing the immense value of my hardware stores, confidently stating that Barbara was entitled to half of the corporate valuation, plus half of all current cash reserves. He mentioned my car collection, demanding they be sold and the proceeds split. He concluded by demanding the primary residence free and clear, leaving me with the lake house, and presenting a monthly alimony figure that would have bled me dry-dawed. When he finally stopped talking, the room fell silent. The mediator looked at Arthur, waiting for our counter-offer. Arthur did not open a binder. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, thin file. He looked directly at Vance. Arthur calmly stated that Mr. Vance's calculations were fundamentally flawed due to a misunderstanding of the marital estate's assets. Vance scoffed and asked what we meant. Arthur handed Vance a certified copy of the family legacy trust documents, complete with Barbara's notarized signature on the spousal waiver from 12 years ago. Arthur explained that the 3 hardware stores, the commercial real estate they occupied, and all associated corporate accounts were the exclusive property of an irrevocable trust. My client, Arthur stated, is merely an employee and a trustee. He owns no equity in the business. Therefore, the business is not subject to division. Its value is $0 in this proceeding. I watched Barbara's face change. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. She leaned over and aggressively whispered to Vance. Vance quickly scanned the trust document, his eyes darting across the pages. His smug demeanor evaporated. He knew instantly that the document was ironclad. He had not done his due diligence. He had relied on Barbara's assumptions. Before Vance could recover, Arthur handed over the next document. It was the promissory note for the classic cars. Arthur explained that the vehicles had been legally sold weeks prior to the filing of the divorce petition. The marital estate did not own classic cars. It owned a long-term debt instrument. He offered to let Barbara have half the monthly payment, which amounted to roughly $200 a month. Barbara interrupted the proceedings. Her voice was shrill. She demanded to know what was happening. She pointed at me, accusing me of hiding money. Arthur calmly reminded her that she had signed the trust documents herself over a decade ago. He then pulled out the final piece of paper. It was the bank statement showing my withdrawal of exactly 50% of the joint funds. Arthur stated that my client had proactively separated the liquid assets fairly and equitably. The reality of the situation crashed down on Barbara. The massive payday she had been banking on was an illusion. The multi-million-dollar business she thought she was having was entirely untouchable. The cash she thought she would take the lion's share of was already split down the middle. All that remained to be negotiated was the equity in the 2 houses and her alimony claim, which would be severely limited given that I was nearing retirement age and my official salary from the trust was modest.
Vance requested a private recess. He and Barbara went into an adjoining room. Through the thick walls, I could hear the muffled sounds of an intense argument. Her voice grew louder, frantic and angry. Vance was speaking in sharp, defensive tones. 10 minutes later, they returned to the table. Vance looked defeated. Barbara looked panicked. She stared at me, searching my face for any sign of sympathy. She found absolutely none. Vance formally withdrew their initial offer. He stated they needed time to reevaluate their position based on this new documentation. The mediator ended the session, noting that we were very far apart. Arthur and I shook the mediator's hand, gathered our few papers, and walked out. I didn't look back at Barbara. The backlash was immediate. The very next morning, Barbara called me. Her tone had completely changed. The cold, calculating woman was gone, replaced by a desperate, crying wife. She told me she had fired Vance. She told me he had pressured her, that her friends had given her terrible advice, and that she was going through a severe midlife crisis. She begged me to come back to the primary residence. She said we could tear up the divorce papers, go to counseling, and fix our marriage. She claimed she didn't really want a divorce. She just wanted my attention. I sat on the porch of the lake house, listening to her sob into the phone. 34 years is a long time. A younger version of myself might have believed her. A weaker man might have caved to the tears and the history. But I could not unsee that spreadsheet. I could not forget the meticulous planning, the photographs of my files, and the deliberate attempt to strip me of my life's work. She did not regret her actions. She regretted that her plan had failed. She wasn't backtracking because she loved me. She was backtracking because she realized she was going to have to downsize her lifestyle significantly. I waited for her to stop crying. When the line finally went quiet, I spoke. I told her that there was no fixing this. I told her that the marriage was over the second she sent that email to Robert Vance. I explained that I would not fight her over the primary residence. She could have the house. We would sell the lake house and split the proceeds. She already had her half of the cash. That was her settlement. I told her my new lawyer would be sending over a revised agreement by the end of the week, and if she contested it, I would drag the process out until her legal fees consumed whatever cash she had left. She started crying again, begging me to reconsider, telling me she loved me. I hung up the phone. I blocked her number on my personal cell phone and instructed Arthur to handle all future communication. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the dock, looking out at the water. I had lost my wife, my home, and the future I thought I had planned. But I had kept my dignity, I had protected my legacy for my grandchildren, and I had survived the ambush. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Without the business to fight over, and with the liquid assets already divided, there was little left for her new, cheaper attorney to argue about. The judge awarded her the primary residence and a very modest alimony payment based on my actual drawn salary from the trust, not the massive corporate profits she had anticipated. She had to sell her country club membership to afford the property taxes on the large house. I bought a smaller, comfortable property closer to the main hardware store. I spend my weekends teaching my grandson how to use basic tools, knowing that one day, he will run the company his grandmother tried to destroy. Sometimes, people ask me if I am lonely, or if I regret how coldly I handled the end of my marriage. I tell them I don't regret a single action I took. When someone shows you they are willing to burn your house down while you are still inside it, you don't offer them a glass of water. You lock the door, protect your valuables, and watch them strike the match, secure in the knowledge that you fireproofed the walls while they weren't looking.